Forget everything you think you know about the Nolan Wells case for a moment, because the biggest questions may be sitting inside one small window of time. 30 minutes. That's it. A pivotal 30-minute period surrounding Nolan's disappearance is now being picked apart, with conflicting accounts, changing timelines, and unanswered questions about what happened after the fights on Horn Island. And the more the timeline is examined, the more complicated it becomes. The central issue is not simply where Nolan went. It is what happened between the last confirmed sightings and the moment the boats left the island. That window could be critical. The timeline being discussed was assembled from reports, interviews, and accounts attributed to people who were on or around Horn Island that day. The argument is that when those accounts are placed side by side, certain details don't appear to line up neatly. And that's where the story gets interesting. One of the most important voices in this timeline is Nolan's friend Javon. In the account presented, Javon says he last personally saw Nolan around 3 p.m., with Nolan near the front of the boat and a girl. Later, Javon describes an altercation involving another friend. He says he went to check on that person for roughly 15 to 20 minutes. When he returned, Nolan's boat and the people who had been with Nolan were gone. That statement matters because it creates a very specific sequence. Nolan was there. A fight or altercation happened. Javon left temporarily. And when he returned, the boat was gone. But what happened to Nolan? That is the question sitting at the center of everything. The timeline becomes even more complicated when the reported fights are brought into the picture. The discussion surrounding the case describes an initial altercation followed by another confrontation. There have also been photographs and video material interpreted as showing activity around the same period. And this is where the timeline starts getting messy. Different accounts appear to place events at slightly different times. The second fight is particularly important because one piece of material is discussed as having been recorded around 4:01 p.m. If that timing is accurate, then it creates a problem for any version of events suggesting that Nolan had already disappeared much earlier. Because now we're dealing with activity around 4 p.m. And that's important because the boat's GPS data is discussed as placing a departure around 4:30 p.m. So suddenly, we're looking at a critical stretch between approximately 4 o'clock and 4:30. What happened during those minutes? Who was still on the island? Who was on which boat? Where was Nolan? And who actually saw him? Those questions become even more important because of Warren's account. Warren reportedly says that Nolan was called to get on the boat. The explanation presented is that there was an issue with the boat and people were preparing to leave. According to that account, someone yelled for Nolan to get on the boat, with Nolan allegedly responding that he was staying behind. But this is where the timeline raises an uncomfortable question. If Nolan was close enough to hear someone shouting at him and close enough to respond loudly enough for people on the boat to hear him, why did other people nearby apparently not hear the exchange? That doesn't prove that the exchange didn't happen. But it is one of the questions that deserves attention, especially because Katie was reportedly nearby. Javon was also connected to the group, and Nolan's coach was reportedly on the island around this broader period. The coach's account is particularly important in the discussion because he reportedly spoke with Nolan around 3:30 p.m. and said Nolan did not appear heavily intoxicated. That directly challenges another claim being discussed around the case. The intoxication issue matters because it affects how people interpret Nolan's behavior. If he was extremely intoxicated, one explanation for certain decisions might appear more plausible. But if he wasn't, then people naturally start asking different questions. Why would he remain behind? Why would he refuse to leave? Why would people who knew him allow him to stay? And why didn't someone make sure he got onto a boat? These questions become even more striking because Nolan was reportedly a Division I athlete with an upcoming tryout. The timeline presented argues that this was something important to him. So again, the question becomes whether his behavior that afternoon fits the picture being presented. Then there is the issue of the boats. This is one of the most confusing parts of the timeline. The accounts discussed refer to multiple boats leaving the island. Javon's statement reportedly refers to Nolan's boat and the people who were with him being gone. Other accounts discuss additional boats leaving around the same period. There are also questions about a second boat connected to Wyatt and who actually operated it. That brings another name into the discussion, Jerry, Wyatt's grandfather. The material presented points to a report listing Jerry as an involved party, along with Bart, while some of the young men are described differently in the documentation. That doesn't establish wrongdoing. But it raises another question about who is operating which boat and who was actually present when the boats departed. And that's precisely why the 30-minute window matters. If you can establish who was where, when each boat left, and who remained on the island, the timeline becomes much easier to understand. But right now, the competing accounts leave room for questions. There is also the question of why certain people did not appear on Officer Tatum's show, a subject that has generated significant online discussion. Some people have connected that absence to the wrongful death litigation and maritime law questions surrounding the case. That theory has to be treated as speculation, but it is part of the broader conversation because civil liability could become extremely important depending on what the evidence ultimately shows. And this is where maritime law enters the story. The discussion around the case suggests that if negligence involving a vessel contributed to Nolan's death, civil liability could become a major issue. That is why the alleged statement that Nolan was repeatedly told to get onto the boat has attracted so much attention. Because if someone can establish that reasonable efforts were made to get Nolan safely aboard, that could become significant in a wrongful death case. But again, the question is whether the account can be independently supported. Was Nolan actually called? Who heard it? Who saw the interaction? Did Katie hear it? Did Javon hear it? Did anyone else hear Nolan respond? Those are straightforward questions. And they matter because the entire sequence depends heavily on individual recollections. There is another detail that keeps coming back. The people who reportedly remained around Nolan included individuals who knew him well. Javon is described in the discussion as Nolan's close friend. Katie was reportedly known to Nolan's family. His coach reportedly had a meaningful conversation with him earlier that afternoon. So if Nolan was visibly incapacitated, why didn't those people intervene? Why didn't someone insist that he leave? Again, none of these questions establishes what happened to Nolan, but they expose why the timeline deserves careful examination. Then comes the 5:45 p.m. point. The material argues that many of the young people had left Horn Island by approximately that time. The sun wasn't expected to set until later in the evening. That means there was still daylight. So the question becomes, where was Nolan during those hours, and who could have seen him? That's where the investigation becomes increasingly dependent on precise timing. Not rumors, not assumptions, not internet theories. Timing. Who saw Nolan last? What time was it? Where were they standing? Which boat was nearby? When did that boat leave? Who was still on the island? Who had already departed? Those details could completely change how the sequence is understood. And that's why the 30-minute window is receiving so much attention. Because if the established timeline is wrong by even 15 or 20 minutes, the entire chain of events could look different. There is also the question of what happened after the boats departed. Was Nolan still on the island? Did he leave on another boat? Was he somewhere in the water? Was there another confrontation? The material presented raises those possibilities, but it does not establish which one occurred. That's precisely where the case remains unresolved. The public has heard different accounts. Some details have been challenged. Some claims have been contradicted by other statements. And some important questions remain unanswered. The intoxication question is one example. The boat departure timeline is another. The alleged conversation between Nolan and the people leaving is another. And the identities and roles of the people operating the different boats create yet another layer. Then there is the legal battle. If Nolan's family pursues a wrongful death claim, the precise timeline could become extremely important. Civil cases operate differently from criminal investigations, and the question of negligence could become central if the evidence supports such a claim. That is why people are scrutinizing every minute. Because one sentence in one person's account could potentially become extremely important. But that also means every claim needs to be separated from what is actually established. The biggest danger in a case like this is allowing speculation to become accepted as fact simply because a particular theory sounds convincing. The timeline should be tested against evidence. GPS information, phone records, photographs, videos, witness statements, official reports, and anything else capable of establishing where people actually were. That's what could finally answer the questions surrounding those 30 minutes. Because right now, the mystery remains. Nolan was seen. There were altercations. People began leaving. Boats departed. And somewhere inside that sequence is the answer to what happened next. The question is whether the existing timeline tells the complete story, or whether important pieces are still missing. And that's why this case isn't simply about one person's version of events. It's about putting every version beside the others and asking a very basic question. Do all of these accounts actually fit together? If they do, the timeline should demonstrate it. If they don't, then those inconsistencies need to be explained. Because somewhere between the fights, the boats leaving, the alleged calls for Nolan to come aboard, and that crucial 30-minute window lies the part of this case that people still don't fully understand. And until that timeline is completely reconstructed, the biggest question remains exactly where it started. What happened to Nolan during those pivotal minutes?